The string lights swayed over the backyard table, and for one suspended second, nobody at Isla Pruitt's family dinner was breathing. Her hand rested on Graham Sterling's shoulder, fingers pale against the navy of his shirt. A glass of red wine hovered, forgotten, halfway to a stranger's mouth. "Everyone," Isla said, her voice bright and brittle at once. "I'd like you to meet my future husband." Across the table, a man in a gray suit went rigid. Beside him, a woman with dark hair pressed a hand to her open mouth. Graham's arm was still half raised, palm out, the way a man raises his hand when he means to say no. He never got the chance. 3 hours earlier, the sun had not yet dropped behind the oaks on Bull Street, and Graham Sterling was on his knees in front of apartment 6, replacing a stripped screw in a loose doorknob. This was the kind of work that filled his days, now quiet, useful, forgettable. At Magnolia Row, he was simply the maintenance guy, a title he wore the way other men wore a wedding ring they no longer noticed. Poppy sat cross-legged on the stairs above him, swinging her sneakers against the railing, narrating a story about a girl at school who could supposedly talk to cats. Graham listened with half his attention, the other half on the screw, and it was enough. 9 years old and endlessly certain of the world's wonder she was, most days, the only certainty he had left. Isla Pruitt lived 2 doors down, in the unit with the porch light that never quite stayed on. Graham had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with her since she'd moved in 3 months ago, a returned package, a comment about the heat, an offer to look at a dripping faucet she'd declined. She was polite in the specific, careful way of someone keeping the world at arm's length. He recognized the posture. He had worn it himself, once. That afternoon she came down the stairs already dressed for something formal, a phone pressed to her ear, her voice pitched low and tight. "I said I'd be there, Mom. I don't need you to remind me twice." A pause, her jaw working. "No. I'm not bringing anyone. I told you that already." Another pause. Longer. "Fine. Fine. I'll figure something out." She hung up and stood very still on the landing, the kind of stillness that comes right before a person decides whether to cry or simply keep walking. Graham, still kneeling by the door, pretended not to have heard any of it. Poppy had no such instinct for pretending. "Are you okay?" She called down, swinging her legs to a stop. Isla blinked, startled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just family stuff." "Does she have friends, Dad?" Poppy asked Graham later. Once Isla had disappeared back inside, in the blunt way only a child can ask something that adults spend years avoiding. Graham considered the question longer than he meant to. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't think she has very many." An hour after that, he found Isla sitting alone on the building's back steps, dressed and ready and going nowhere, staring at nothing in particular. She looked the way he remembered feeling in the year after Claire died, dressed for a life she wasn't sure she still wanted to attend. "You look like someone who could use a ride," he said, not unkindly. She glanced up, surprised he'd noticed her at all. "It's a family dinner. You really don't want to come to that." "I wasn't doing anything tonight anyway," Graham said, which was true, and also the smallest lie of the evening, because he had planned to spend it exactly the way he spent most nights, quietly, with Poppy, avoiding the parts of his own past that still ached when touched. Besides, free dinner. Isla studied him for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't name. Then, for reasons she wouldn't fully understand until much later, she said yes. Inside his apartment, Graham changed his shirt twice before settling on the navy one, a small vanity he hadn't indulged in years. Poppy sat on his bed, supervising with the seriousness of a stylist. "You look nice," she declared, and then, because she was 9 and unafraid of the obvious, added, "Are you nervous?" "It's just dinner," Graham said. "You changed your shirt twice." He had no good answer for that. He hadn't dressed for anyone's benefit since Claire, and the fact that some small, unexamined part of him had wanted to look presentable tonight was not a thought he was ready to sit with. He kissed the top of Poppy's head, dropped her at the neighbors for the evening, and told himself it meant nothing at all. The drive out to the Pruitt house took 20 minutes, most of it silent, the savannah evening gold and thick through the windshield. It was Isla who finally spoke, her eyes on the passing oak strung with moss. "I should warn you," she said. "My mother invites people to these dinners the way other people set traps." "Traps for what?" "For me, mostly." She almost laughed, but it came out thin. "Tonight she's decided I need rescuing. From loneliness. From my divorce. From myself. She has a way of making an entire evening feel like an intervention." Graham said nothing, but something in his chest recognized the shape of that sentence. He knew what it was to sit at a table and feel like the subject of a conversation no one would say out loud. The Pruitt house sat behind an iron gate on a street lined with magnolias, older than the state itself. String lights already glowing across a backyard set for a dinner far grander than anything Graham had attended in years. He felt, briefly, like a man who had wandered onto the wrong stage, but he squared his shoulders, buttoned his cuff, and followed Isla through the gate as though he belonged there, because that, too, was a skill he had once been very good at. Inside, introductions moved past him in a blur of names and handshakes until he reached a silver-haired man near the bar, glass of bourbon in hand, who looked at Graham a beat too long. "Sterling," the man said slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "Graham Sterling?" "That's right." The man's eyebrows rose. "I'll be damned. You're the engineer. The one who walked off the Riverside Tower job." He said it loud enough that two nearby guests turned their heads. "I heard you refused to sign off on the foundation plans. Cost you your whole career, didn't it? I always wondered what happened to you, figured you'd left the state." The words landed in the middle of the party like a dropped glass. Isla, 3 feet away with a canapé halfway to her mouth, went very still. "You must have me confused with someone else," Graham said evenly, offering a smile that closed the subject the way a door closes on a draft. The old man frowned, unconvinced but unwilling to press further, and let himself be steered toward the bar by his wife. The moment passed. The party resumed its low hum of laughter and ice cubes, though a few heads stayed turned a beat longer than politeness required, the way heads do when something interesting has almost happened and might yet happen again. Graham exhaled slowly and reached for a glass of water he didn't want, just to give his hands something to do. But Isla was still looking at him. "Engineer?" she said quietly, once they had a corner of the yard to themselves. "You told me you did maintenance." "I do," Graham said. "That's what I do now." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze a moment longer than the question required, and something passed between them, not an answer, but an acknowledgement that there was one. "It's a long story," he said finally. "Not tonight's." Isla let it go, because the alternative was admitting how much she suddenly wanted to know. She filed the name away, Riverside Tower, the way she filed away every detail that didn't fit the picture in front of her. No one at that party understood, in that moment, how close they had come to a truth 8 years buried. And no one, not Isla, not Graham, not the silver-haired man already forgetting the exchange over a second bourbon, could have guessed that within the hour, it would not be Graham's secret that split the evening open, but hers. Diane Pruitt arrived at the party the way weather arrives, announced before she was seen, felt before she was heard. She moved through the yard collecting hugs and compliments with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 30 years hosting exactly this kind of evening, and when she reached her daughter, her smile sharpened by exactly 1 degree. "Isla, darling, you didn't tell me you were bringing a guest." Her eyes swept over Graham with the swiftness of an appraisal. Clothing, posture, the calluses on his hands when he shook hers, and filed him somewhere just beneath acceptable. "How lovely. And who is this?" "Graham," Isla said. "My neighbor." "Neighbor," Diane repeated, in the tone of a woman noting a typo. "Well, there's someone I want you to meet properly tonight." She took Isla by the elbow, steering her toward the far end of the yard, and Graham watched them go the way a man watches weather change, aware something was coming, unsure yet what. The man Diane presented with a flourish was younger than Graham expected, tailored suit, easy smile, the kind of handshake that lingered half a second too long. "Bennett Ashgate," he said. "You must be the famous Isla. Your mother's told me so much." Isla's expression didn't move. "Has she?" In the kitchen, a few minutes later, Diane cornered her daughter over a tray of deviled eggs. Her voice dropped to the register she used for things she didn't want overheard. Pruitt and Sons has been trying to get inside the Ashgate development pipeline for 2 years. Isla. 2 years. Bennett's family controls half the permits that matter in this city. This dinner is not a coincidence. So I'm the merger, Isla said flatly. Don't be dramatic. I'm saying the timing is good. He's charming, he's available, and frankly, sweetheart, so are you, and you haven't exactly been putting yourself out there since the divorce. Diane's tone softened, but not enough to lose its edge. I only want you happy and secure. Is that so terrible? Isla didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to. Outside, Graham stood near the drinks table with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, watching Isla's shoulders through the kitchen window, the particular rigidity of a person absorbing a blow they'd been braced for their whole life. He recognized it. He had spent years watching people brace the same way, right before the ground shifted under them. Bennett found him there a moment later, drink in hand, gaze flicking briefly to Graham's calloused knuckles and the slight fray at his shirt cuff. So Isla's neighbor. What is it you do? Maintenance, Graham said. Buildings, mostly. Huh. Bennett's smile didn't waver, but something behind it cooled by several degrees. Good honest work. Somebody's got to keep the lights on while the rest of us handle the real estate. He said it lightly, the way a man says something cruel while pretending it's a joke, then clapped Graham once on the shoulder and moved off toward the bar, already scanning the yard for someone worth his attention. Graham watched him go, unbothered by the insult and far more interested in the way Isla still hadn't come back outside. While he waited, his eyes drifted upward, the way they always did in a house like this one, cataloging things nobody else in the yard would have noticed: the slight settling crack above the porte-cochere, the load-bearing column disguised as decorative brick. Old habits. He used to be able to walk into any room in the state of Georgia and tell you, within a year, when it had been built and by whom. He hadn't lost the eye. He had only stopped being paid for it. Dinner was called not long after, the long table set beneath the string lights, candles guttering faintly in the evening breeze coming off the river 3 blocks away. Diane orchestrated the seating with the precision of a woman who had already decided how the night would end. Isla and Bennett placed across from each other, close enough for conversation, far enough to look accidental. Graham found himself seated near the far end, beside an elderly aunt who wanted to discuss the price of shrimp, and from there he watched the evening tighten around Isla, like a hand closing slowly into a fist. Diane rose halfway through the second course, wineglass in hand, and the table quieted the way tables do when a hostess wants an audience. I just want to say, she began, her voice carrying warmly across the yard, how wonderful it is to have everyone here tonight, especially Bennett, who I think some of us have been hoping to see more of. Her eyes found her daughter. Isla, honey, I know it's been a hard year. But I have a feeling good things are coming, don't you? It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. A ripple of knowing smiles moved down the table, the kind reserved for a couple everyone has already decided is a couple. Bennett lifted his glass with easy confidence, as though the toast were already his to accept. Isla sat frozen, fork suspended over her plate, the old familiar heat rising in her throat, the specific humiliation of being narrated by her own mother in front of a table of witnesses, reduced once again to a problem someone else had decided to solve. She had felt this exact pressure before, at every holiday since her divorce, every dinner where her worth was measured against her availability. She had always found a way to sit through it. Tonight, for reasons she would spend weeks trying to name, she couldn't. Her eyes moved down the table and found Graham's. He wasn't smiling politely like the others. He was watching her the way a person watches someone standing too close to an edge, steady, alert, ready to catch something if it fell. It was such a small thing, that look. It should not have been enough to change the shape of the evening. But something in Isla's chest loosened, and before she had fully decided to move, she was on her feet, crossing behind Bennett's chair, closing the distance to the far end of the table where Graham sat with his fork still in his hand. Her palm landed on his shoulder. The whole yard seemed to still around it, the string lights, the wine, the low murmur of conversation dying into silence as every head turned. "Everyone," she said, her voice bright and brittle at once, "I'd like you to meet my future husband." For a long moment, nobody moved. Diane's wineglass hovered halfway to her lips, her smile frozen in the shape it had held a second earlier, before the meaning of the sentence caught up to her face. Bennett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he recovered fast enough to raise his glass a half-inch, as if toasting a joke he hadn't quite been let in on. Graham said nothing. He couldn't. His hand was still half raised from setting down his fork, and it hung there now, useless, while 19 strangers processed a sentence he hadn't known was coming. He felt Isla's fingers tighten almost imperceptibly against his shoulder, not triumphant, not steady, but trembling, the grip of someone holding onto the edge of something she'd just jumped off of. And it was that tremor, more than the shocked faces around the table, that stopped him from correcting her. He could have. The words were right there, "There's been a misunderstanding." He didn't say them. Instead, he reached up and covered her hand with his own. An instinct he didn't examine too closely, and let the silence stretch until Diane, recovering first, laughed too loudly and said something about champagne. Somewhere down the table, the silver-haired man who had recognized Graham earlier raised his glass with a bewildered grin, muttering to his wife that this was, without question, the most interesting Pruitt dinner he'd attended in a decade. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange, glittering blur, congratulations offered with narrowed eyes, questions Isla deflected with a skill Graham hadn't expected. "How long have you two been together?" someone asked, and Isla answered, "Not long enough for a big story yet," with a smile so practiced it fooled everyone but Graham, who was beginning to understand that beneath the composure she'd shown him earlier that evening was a woman who had spent years learning to perform calm for an audience that never once asked if the performance cost her anything. Bennett's smile never quite reached his eyes again for the remainder of the evening. Somewhere in the middle of it, Poppy arrived, dropped off early by a friend's mother, hair still damp from a pool party, marching straight across the lawn toward her father with the fearless directness of a 9-year-old who had not been told there were rules to follow tonight. She took one look at Isla's hand still resting near her father's and asked, with no ceremony at all, "Is she going to be my new mom?" A ripple of soft laughter moved down the table, the first real laughter of the night, and for a moment the tension cracked just enough to let something warmer through. Isla knelt to Poppy's height, her earlier panic dissolving into something gentler. "I don't know about that," she said, smiling for the first time all evening that reached her eyes. "But I'd love to be your friend." Poppy seemed to find this an entirely acceptable answer and wandered off toward the dessert table, unaware she had just been the only honest thing said at the entire dinner. Later, once the guests had thinned and the candles burned low, Graham and Isla found a quiet corner of the yard, away from the string lights, where the dark pooled soft around them. "I am so sorry," Isla said, the words tumbling out before he could speak. "I don't even know what happened. I couldn't sit there one more second and be talked about like I wasn't in the room." Graham studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the low light. "Why me?" he asked quietly. It was, she would realize much later, the only question that mattered. 3 days later, Isla sat at her desk on the 4th floor of the Redevelopment Authority building, a stack of files spread across the surface like a losing hand of cards. The Ashgate Riverside Tower, Phase 2, was scheduled for public hearing in 11 days, and something about the file had been nagging at her since Sunday night, a name she couldn't stop turning over. Riverside Tower. The same project the silver-haired man at her mother's party had mentioned. The same project Graham had denied knowing anything about. She was still staring at the foundation schematics when Colette Breyer appeared in her doorway, a manila folder pressed to her chest, like something that might otherwise escape. "Do you have a minute?" Colette asked. Her voice had none of its usual ease. Isla waved her in, and Colette closed the door behind her, a small gesture, but one she'd never made before in 3 years of working together. "Before I worked here," Colette said, sitting slowly, "I did an internship. Structural Division. Ashgate Development." She set the folder on the desk but didn't open it yet, her hand resting flat on top as though she needed a moment to decide whether to let it go. 8 years ago. Riverside Tower. Isla's pulse quickened. Go on. There was an inspection report, Colette said. Rebar specifications on the foundation had been cut down from the original engineering plan to save money on the concrete pour. I only knew because I filed the paperwork myself. The lead engineer on the project refused to sign off on it. Filed a formal objection. And a week later he was gone, fired. Blacklisted. The whole file quietly disappeared into storage. She finally opened the folder, sliding a photocopied page across the desk. I kept a copy. I don't fully know why. I think some part of me knew it would matter again someday. Isla's eyes moved down the page, an internal memo, an engineer's signature at the bottom, half obscured, but unmistakable once she knew to look for it. G. Sterling. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and the order to cut the rebar. Isla said slowly. Who signed that? Colette hesitated, and in that hesitation Isla already knew. Preston Ashgate, Colette said. Bennett's father. He was CEO at the time. She looked up, meeting Isla's eyes directly. The Phase 2 plans that crossed your desk this week, I pulled the original specs to compare. They're nearly identical to the ones Sterling refused to approve. Same foundation zone, same shortcut, dressed up in new paperwork. Isla sat back slowly, the pieces rearranging themselves into a shape she didn't want to see and couldn't unsee. The man at the party hadn't been confused. Graham hadn't lied about his name, he'd simply refused to say it. And the project she was 2 weeks from approving was built, quite literally, on the same fault line that had once cost him everything. She thought of her mother's voice in the kitchen. Pruitt and Sons has been trying to get inside the Ashgate pipeline for 2 years, and felt something in her chest go cold and clear at once. If I bring this forward, she said quietly, more to herself than to Colette, it doesn't just end the Ashgate deal. It ends whatever my mother's been building for months. Colette didn't offer comfort, because there wasn't any to give. I can't testify officially, she said instead. I signed an NDA when I left Ashgate. If I speak up on the record without protection, they'll bury me in litigation before the hearing even starts. Her voice tightened, but I couldn't sit on this, not after everything. She'd carried the folder for 8 years, she admitted, through 2 jobs and 1 move across the state, never quite able to throw it away, and never quite brave enough to use it. I told myself I kept it in case it mattered someday, she said. I think I just meant I was waiting for someday to arrive. Isla looked down at the memo again, at the ghost of Graham's old signature, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the lie she'd told at her mother's table was about to become the smallest secret in the room. She found Graham that evening on the back steps of Magnolia Row, exactly where she'd once found him a lifetime ago, though it had only been a handful of days. Poppy's window glowed gold above them, bath-time laughter drifting faintly through the screen. Isla didn't sit. She held out the folder instead, her hand steadier than she felt. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Graham looked at the folder for a long moment before he took it, and when he opened it and saw the memo, something in his face went very still, the particular stillness of a man revisiting a room he'd spent 8 years locked out of. Where did you get this? Colette. She interned at Ashgate the year you left. Isla's voice was gentle but did not waver. Graham, is it true? He closed the folder slowly. Yes. And then, because there was nothing left to protect by staying quiet, he told her. He told her about the foundation plans, about the meeting where he'd said the numbers didn't work and been told to make them work anyway, about the objection he'd filed in writing because he no longer trusted anyone to remember a verbal one, about the firing that followed within the week, quiet and clean, no explanation offered because none was owed, about the calls that stopped coming once his name stopped opening doors, and about Claire, how the stress of that year had settled into her body at the worst possible time, how the woman he loved had gotten sick while he was too busy fighting a war he was already losing to notice, how he had buried his wife 8 months after burying his career, and how, after that, he had simply stopped trying to be the man he used to be, because that man had cost him everything he loved. I didn't tell you, he said finally, because I didn't want you to look at me the way that man at the party did. Like a cautionary tale. Isla sat down beside him then, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I need to take this to the hearing," she said. "The Phase 2 plans are the same design. If it goes through, it could fail exactly the way you said it would 8 years ago, except now, it's not a theory. It's a building full of people." Graham was quiet for a long time. "If you do this, your mother's deal is dead. Whatever she's been building toward. I know. And it puts a target on you. I know that too." Isla met his eyes. "I'm doing it anyway." The night before the hearing, Graham sat on the edge of Poppy's bed while she fought sleep, and found himself explaining, in the simplest terms he could manage, that tomorrow he had to tell a room full of strangers something true that he'd spent a long time not saying. "Is it a scary true thing?" Poppy asked, eyes already half closed. "A little. Mom always said the scary true things are the ones that matter most." She said it the way children repeat things they've heard 100 times without quite knowing they're comforting someone with it. Graham sat with that for a long moment after her breathing evened out, grateful, not for the first time, that some part of Claire had never left this apartment at all. The hearing, when it came, filled the city council chambers with more people than the room had likely seen in years. Engineers, reporters. Half of Isla's extended family seated stiffly near the back. Bennett arrived flanked by 2 lawyers, his easy charm replaced by something harder around the eyes. Diane sat beside him, her knuckles white around her purse. Isla stood at the podium and laid out the timeline without flourish, the original specifications, the objection, the firing, the near-identical Phase 2 design now awaiting approval. Bennett interrupted twice, was gavelled down twice, his composure fraying visibly with each attempt. Diane rose once, as if to intervene on her daughter's behalf against her daughter, and sat back down when no words came. Then Colette stood, her voice shaking but clear, and confirmed every detail on the record. NDA and consequences be damned. And then Graham rose. He had not spoken publicly about Riverside Tower in 8 years. His voice, when it came, was quiet at first, then steadier with every sentence, as though the truth had simply been waiting this long for permission. He described the original report in plain, technical detail, no accusation, no theatrics, just the facts of a foundation that would not hold the weight it was being asked to bear. The council voted that same night to suspend the Phase 2 permit pending independent structural review. Bennett left the chambers without a word to anyone. By the time the doors closed behind him, the room had already stopped watching him leave. The days that followed moved through the Pruitt family like weather clearing after a long storm, slow, uneven, leaving wreckage in places no one had thought to check. Diane's calls to old business contacts went unanswered for the first time in years. The Ashgate name, once a byword for opportunity in certain Savannah circles, had become something people mentioned carefully, if at all. Diane found her daughter in the kitchen one evening, the same kitchen where she'd once cornered her over a tray of deviled eggs, and for once had nothing prepared to say. "I only wanted things to be easier for you," she finally managed. "I know," Isla said, and she did know it, even now that her mother's manipulations had never come from cruelty, only from a narrower kind of fear. The fear of a woman who measured safety in contracts and last names. "But easier isn't the same as right, Mom. You almost married me into covering up something that could have killed people." Diane had no answer for that. It was, Isla thought, the first time in her adult life she had watched her mother run out of words entirely. It would take longer than a single kitchen conversation to rebuild what had cracked between them, and both women seemed to understand that without needing to say it. Diane didn't apologize again that night, but she also didn't argue, and for Diane Pruitt, Isla knew, that silence was its own kind of surrender. Bennett tried, for a week or two, to salvage what he could a threatened lawsuit against the city, a strongly worded letter from his father's old attorneys, but the independent review came back within days, confirming everything Graham and Colette had said, and the lawsuit quietly evaporated before it ever reached a courtroom. The Ashgate name would recover eventually, the way old money always does, but Bennett's political ambitions in this particular city had ended before they'd properly begun. Isla, for the first time she could remember, had chosen a side that cost her something and did not regret it. It felt less like rebellion and more like waking up in a room she'd been standing in her whole life without noticing the furniture. She found Graham that Friday evening on the back steps again, their steps, she realized, without quite meaning to think of them that way. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, sitting beside him, "for telling the truth. Even after everything, it cost you the first time. You're the one who put your career on the line," Graham said. "I just said what I should have said 8 years ago." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in a way silence rarely is between two people still learning each other's edges. "Can I ask you something?" Isla said eventually. "That night at my mother's, I still don't fully understand why I said it." "Why you?" Out of every person at that table, Graham considered the question with the same care he gave everything. "Maybe you already knew I wouldn't let you fall for it," he said. Even before either of us understood why, Isla looked down at her hands, a small, private smile finding its way onto her face. "I keep waiting to regret it," she admitted. "The lie. I keep waiting for it to feel like a mistake. And it doesn't," she said. "Not even a little." Neither of them said what else was sitting, unspoken. In the space between them, the thing that had been true since the moment her hand first landed on his shoulder, long before either of them had a name for it. 3 weeks later, an email arrived in Graham's inbox from a structural engineering firm 2 states over, one of the independent reviewers who had examined the Ashgate Foundation plans and, in the process, examined his old report as well. They wanted to talk, not about a job, exactly, not yet, but about a consulting role reviewing safety compliance on municipal projects across the Southeast. Nobody used the word redemption. Nobody needed to. He read the email twice at the kitchen table, then a third time, before he let himself believe it. It wasn't a rescue. Nobody was doing him a favor. They wanted him because the report he'd filed 8 years ago, buried and ignored at the time, had turned out to be exactly right, and that kind of correctness, it seemed, still counted for something in this business. Even 8 years late, Poppy found him still staring at the screen when she wandered in for a glass of water. "Good news or bad news, face?" she asked. An old game between them. "Good," Graham said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it entirely. That Saturday, Isla showed up at his door with a bag of flour and a recipe she'd printed off the internet, insisting Poppy had promised to teach her to make proper Southern biscuits, a promise Poppy did not appear to remember making but was delighted to honor anyway. The kitchen filled with flour dust and laughter and Poppy's increasingly bossy instructions about butter temperature, and for 2 hours nobody in that apartment mentioned Ashgate, or Diane, or hearings, or anything at all that belonged to the version of their lives that had existed before the string lights and the wine glasses and one impossible sentence. Later, once Poppy had gone to bed with flour still in her hair, Isla lingered in the doorway instead of leaving. "I keep finding reasons to come back here," she admitted, half to herself. "I noticed," Graham said. "I don't need a reason anymore." "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "I think that might be the whole point." Poppy's voice drifted from her bedroom, half asleep and half triumphant, insisting she'd already decided the biscuits were the best thing she'd ever made, and that this fact was not up for debate in the morning. Isla laughed quietly, the sound settling into the apartment like it belonged there. She didn't leave that night. Not in any dramatic way, she simply stayed a while longer, sitting on his porch step in the dark, close enough that their shoulders touched again, the way they had that first night on the back steps of Magnolia Row, except now there was no lie holding them there. Just 2 people who had run out of reasons to keep their distance. The evening came weeks later, warm and unhurried. The kind Savannah produces only a handful of times a year, the air thick with jasmine, the river 3 blocks off, catching the last orange light before dusk folded it away. Graham had strung lights along his own back porch. Nothing as grand as the Pruitt yard. Just a simple loop bought from a hardware store 2 aisles over from the paint he restocked every Tuesday. Poppy had helped him hang them, standing on a chair she wasn't supposed to be standing on, insisting the middle strand needed to droop just a little more. Isla arrived as the sky was turning violet, a bottle of wine in one hand, her hair loose the way she rarely wore it anymore, as though something in her had finally stopped needing armor. Poppy commandeered her almost immediately for a game involving chalk and the porch steps, and it was a long while before the 2 adults found themselves alone, side by side on the top step, the lights humming faintly above them. "It's funny," Isla said eventually, watching the last of the daylight drain out of the yard. "Every party I've been to at my mother's house, I spent trying to disappear, and the one time I made a scene," she stopped, huffed a small laugh at herself. "The one time I said something completely insane in front of 20 people, it turned out to be the only honest thing I said all year." "Not the only thing," Graham said. She looked at him. "You also said you weren't bringing anyone to dinner," he pointed out. "And then you brought me anyway. That's different, is it?" Isla considered this, turning her wineglass slowly by the stem. "If I hadn't said it that night," she started. "If I just sat there and let her set me up with Bennett, let the whole thing play out the way she wanted." Graham didn't let her finish. He reached over, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, with the same steady, unhurried patience he brought to everything he did, and she found, somewhere in the middle of the sentence she never finished, that she no longer needed to. Poppy's laughter drifted up from the yard below, chalk dust on her knees, utterly uninterested in whatever quiet thing was happening on the porch steps above her. The lights swayed gently in the evening breeze. The same string-light glow that had once framed a lie told out of desperation in front of a table full of strangers. Except this time, there was no audience. No mother orchestrating an outcome. No 20 pairs of eyes waiting for the wrong kind of ending. Down in the yard, Poppy abandoned her chalk long enough to shout up at them that the biscuits from Saturday had definitely, absolutely been better than the ones from the grocery store, a verdict neither adult on the porch felt qualified to dispute. Graham laughed, low and easy, a sound Isla was still learning to memorize, and reached for her hand, the way he had reached for it that first impossible night. Except this time there was nothing to explain, nothing to correct, no room full of strangers, waiting to see how the story would end. Just two people who had once needed a lie to say what was true, and had finally stopped needing one at all.